democracy is under attack. Healthcare, voting rights, reproductive justice is under attack. Gender equality, fairness are under attack. Criminal justice is under attack. Attention, our democracy is under attack.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this timely and critical conversation around the current attacks on our freedoms and democracy, attacks that are particularly taking place across the South. I'm Anisha Hardy. I'm the Executive Director of Alabama Values, a grassroots communications organization that is working to raise awareness and increase engagement around issues impacting Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and other marginalized communities. We work directly with and provide communication support and narrative strategies for grassroots and civic organizations in Alabama and across the South. Organizations that are advocating to build power and break down barriers to civic participation. We approach our work on the foundational belief that narrative and messaging is critical to building equitable power structures, increasing civic engagement, and countering attacks on our democracy. This event is made possible by Democracy Under Attack, an Alabama Values initiative in partnership with the Southern Leadership for Voter Engagement, also known as SOLVE, and the Groundworks Project. The goal of Democracy Under Attack is to leverage hybrid events, digital campaigns, and narrative strategies to raise awareness and connect community issues to people's front door. The theme for this evening's discussion is As Goes the South, State Legislative Session Edition. Now, the South holds a high concentration of communities that are directly impacted by these unfair practices and policies that we are seeing move across the region, particularly communities of color and LGBTQ plus communities. Historically, the South has been a place where attacks on democracy happen, and these attacks not only impact the region, but also have far-reaching implications for the entire country. Yet states like Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee are often overlooked in mainstream discussions about potential threats to democracy, or areas needing investments to protect democratic principles, or locations of key battlegrounds. But I'm here to tell you that the battle is where the war is. And if you've been paying attention, you would notice that these states have become breeding grounds for policies that have had, national implications across issue areas such as voting rights, criminal justice, reproductive rights, and LGBTQ plus rights. So I hope that this evening's conversation provides insights on key issues and illuminate how they are connected and how you can get involved in being a part of the change that you want to see. Our conversation is being moderated by Jamal Watkins, the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP. And considering Jamal's commitment to justice, equity, inclusion, and liberation, I couldn't think of anyone better to guide us through this conversation. I am confident that he is going to help us stand on business this evening and keep us on track. So Jamal, thank you for leading us in this critical discussion. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Anisha, and we are extremely proud of your leadership and the work that is happening in Alabama with the broader coalition. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jamal Watkins, and as Anisha lifted up, I proudly serve as a member of the national team at the NAACP. I'm actually in the great state of California. It is our 55th annual Image Awards week, and as many of you know, how we're treated in public policy is many times influenced by what folks see or don't see on the screen and in the media. And so as we begin this discussion this evening, I almost link this notion that for many years, decades, we are in a bad reality television loop targeting people of color, communities of color, working communities, and in particular, communities in the South. Now, we know that democracy is rooted on the notion that every voice should be heard. But if you go to any Southern state, we're confronted with continuous and relentless, the sort of onslaught of legislation that not only suppresses voters, but is really about targeting marginalized communities. Think anti-DE&I, anti-LGBTQ measures, the attack on women's autonomy in terms of their bodies, and just literally the systematic undermining of democracy ideals. And we know that the battle against these progressive laws are not only fought in the public square, but also in the courts, and has really captured the attention of the entire nation as many advocates and community folk work hard and tirelessly to safeguard our rights. So this evening, we're going to take a closer look at the coordinated legislative attacks on democracy happening right now during state legislative sessions across the South. And I, myself, being a child of the South, think Piedmont, Alabama, Rome, Georgia, where my family comes from, understands that that's the front lines. And that is literally where the line is being drawn in many ways to shape who we are moving forward as a nation. So throughout the discussion, we encourage viewers to drop their questions and comments in the comment section of whatever platform you're viewing in terms of the discussion, and we will answer these during our Q&A portion. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our panel of speakers, and they will each bring their own critical perspective and expertise to the conversation and really talk about these legislative measures and discuss the strategies for true resistance and advocacy. Now, I'm not reading long bios because we want to get into the meat. And so we're going to encourage you to look up these individuals as well as their organizations. But I'm going to start off by naming who's joining the conversation this evening. We have Ryan Wagner, who is the Senior Policy Manager at Black Voters Matter Fund, an amazing organization. We love Cliff and Latasha, so welcome, Ryan. We have Steve Adelson, Program Director at Civic Tennessee. And as you all know, Tennessee has been on the forefront and literally in the news around all of the fights at their seat of power in terms of the state capitol. We have our amazing friend, Ashley Shelton, who is a founder and CEO of the Power Coalition in the great state of Louisiana. Ashley, welcome. We have Jerome Dees, Policy Director at the Southern Poverty Law Center, an amazing institution. We love the work that Margaret Huang and team are really building, and Jerome is a part of that ecosystem. And we have Kyra Roby, who is the Policy Director at One Voice Mississippi. And sometimes I feel like I work for One Voice because I love what Nishambi and team are doing in the great state of Mississippi. And so as we jump right in, I'm going to start with you, Ryan. You know, the South has witnessed a surge, and I'm going to say it again, a surge in voter suppression laws following the 2020 election cycle. We know that the backlash was real, and anti-democratic legislation. With similar attacks appearing all across multiple states, you know, really this sort of coordinated effort happening to undermine the voice of communities. From your experience with Black Voters Matter, how have these laws impacted voter turnout and engagement, and what are the broader implications for democracy in the region?
I would say in terms of impact on voters, it's in alignment with what we saw with the Brennan Center report, right? So 15 percentage points in 2020 in terms of that racial disparity and voter in that gap. Had we voted at the same number of white folks, that would have been 9 million more ballots that would have been cast. It seems like we're on a downward trend with turnout because of a lot of the voter suppression tactics. I don't say that they're new, they're evolving, right? This is the Southern strategy on steroids. And that is manifesting in many, many ways. And I'm not just talking changes in voter ID laws, right? They're manifesting in changes to early voting locations and drop boxes, the removal of drop boxes, if you will, the erosion of gubernatorial powers, like in North Carolina. They've eroded the powers of Roy Cooper in terms of who he selects for the Board of Elections, ballot challenges, the emergence of Moms for Liberty, the election police force in Florida, which has been used as of late to target our formerly incarcerated folks, our returning citizens who duly believed and were told that they had their rights restored. Or if you're in North Carolina, you had your rights back, but then you had them taken away by the legislature and these court decisions, right? So it's reinforcing the importance. I think what folks are starting to see now is the increased importance and the role that the courts play in our lives around these issues. And all of this can be laid at the hands of Shelby v. Holder. And it can also be laid at Citizens United, I would argue, which struck down the prohibitions on what is commonly called how dark money influences our elections and the voices of the American people overall. So not to be a Debbie Downer, from 2008 to 2022, we're seeing a concerning downward trend in terms of our turnout. And I lay that solely at the hands of a lot of the tactics being used across the South.
No, thank you for lifting up that perspective. And folks, as you hear this, you understand that although many of us in this space and structurally and legally, we're nonpartisan, but we're not blind. And we know that as Ryan has lifted up, these attacks, if you will, on our democracy are not necessarily new, but they're coordinated. They are almost being reinvented and remixed and restructured, and they're relentless, meaning the other side, whoever that is not stopping. Their goal is to continue this no matter what. And so when we think about the South being a battleground for voting rights and democracy, we know that Alabama in many ways has often led the charge and has also been in the hot seat. The state's rich history in terms of the civil rights movement also is contrasted by its rich history in the Confederacy, if you will, in terms of the ongoing fight for justice and fair representation. Now, as we know, Alabama and Louisiana recently celebrated significant victories with the redrawing of congressional maps that increases the voting power of Black voters in both states. But kicking off this new year, Alabama's Lieutenant Governor, Will Ainsworth, and if you don't know him, you got to look him up. When you think about his recent quote in an article with 1819 News, he stated, and I'll say this, pay attention to the session. There will be some fireworks first few weeks. We're getting ready to run over some Democrats. It's going to happen. It's time. Now, I don't know about you, but when you hear words like this coming from a lieutenant governor, we realize that something is afoot. And so Alabama is now halfway through its legislative session and has seen a flurry of concerning legislation that shouldn't be partisan or politicized issues. Think SB 129, which limits diversity and inclusion efforts. SB 1, which criminalizes helping voters with their absentee ballot applications. The recent IVF ruling, which all know is ridiculous, impacting reproductive rights. And the What is a Woman Act, which seeks to define gender based on biological sex. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Jerome, as Southern Poverty Law Center's policy director. How have all of these bills collectively impacted civil rights and liberties in Alabama? And what do you see as the broader implications for democracy in the state?
Well, Jamal, thank you for the context and how you laid out that question. And first, let me say it's an honor to be here, the opportunity to share these issues with this incredible panel of individuals who are kind of deep in this fight with this. You all are all kind of our brothers and sisters. And so kind of with that mindset, we're all family here. So Jamal, I think it's important that we not mince words around here. Our democracy truly is under attack, both from a practical and a psychological perspective. Practically speaking, we are witnessing the systematic erosion of freedoms and liberties that we have for generations relied upon as sacrosanct, as you mentioned, free and fair access to the ballot, the ability to have the hard conversations about our country's past and the policy implications of those formerly widely held discriminatory beliefs, bodily autonomy, and the ability of individuals and families to make informed decisions about what is best for them. in all of our states, we've seen some form of legislation or litigation that removes and restricts the freedoms of those foundational principles. Spoken about the practical part, but it's equally important that we have to account for the psychological impact that this deluge of discrimination has on historically oppressed communities. Just kind of an example that I can give is when you're playing a game of dodgeball and one person throws that ball at you, it's pretty easy to kind of step to the left, step to the right, and dodge that ball. But we've all been in that situation in grade school where there are 5, 6, 7 kids all locked in on you, throwing the ball all at once. In that moment, you just kind of succumb, give in, and know that you're going to get nailed by that ball. When we face one attack on our freedoms, it's easy to avoid or even bounce back from a defeat, whether it's in the state capitol or in court. However, when we become confronted with an onslaught of hate and bigotry from all branches of government, we are more likely to surrender and cease our resistance. And that is a key strategic point that I think we all need to fully understand, that this wave of legislation that we're seeing is not just some happenstance. It's not just something that randomly popped up. This is a concerted effort that is being waged against these communities of color with the hopes that we just throw up our hands and say, you know what, we give in, you win. But it's important that we understand that tactic, embrace ourselves, and rely upon community to continue the fight against these particular issues.
And I appreciate you lifting up the notion of the impact on the people and on communities, and this notion that, you know, there's so many balls being thrown at our people and our communities, they can't dodge them all. And taking those hits has not only an emotional toll, but a physical toll. There is research from Brookings with Dr. Andre Perry and the NAACP that shows if you are born Black in this country, if you are born a person of color in this country, Latino, Latinx, API, if you are born into a working class family in this country, it takes years off your life. Because as you just articulated, all the balls being thrown at these communities that they can't dodge are physically and mentally taking a toll. It's not just a policy fight. It is a fight for the lives of our communities. Now, I'm going to move over to the great state of Louisiana. And as you know, Ashley, Leader Shelton, this legislative session marks, you know, for Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry, it's his first regular session. And with the Republican supermajority in both the House and the Senate, these are folks that are throwing balls already. There is an expected shift further to the right in lawmaking. And when you think about Governor Landry's push for a constitutional convention, even more concerns are raised. And so, given this political reality, this political landscape, how do you anticipate the focus on things like crime legislation, such as the expansion of the legal execution methods, charging 17-year-olds as adults, and even this constitutional convention? How will this impact marginal communities or marginalized communities in Louisiana? And what are the potential long-term consequences for the state?
Thank you for having me. And, you know, Jamal, you know all too well these states in the South, and in particular the Deep South, and how, you know, I've said, you know, like it's been clear for years and years and years that, you know, terrible policy is seeded in the Deep South, and then it goes wholesale to the rest of the country in a very short period of time. And that has not changed. We just had a criminal justice special session where all of the things you said have just been passed. There's, you know, there's no parole. You know, they've raised the age. And so charging 17-year-olds, you know, like there's no good time. So you know, in the most incarcerated place in the world, the idea that you may never ever get out has been pretty, you know, a pretty powerful conversation in the state of Louisiana. We have the privilege of working with the Voice of the Experienced Vote, run by Norris Henderson, and you know they have done this work and led this work for this charge for the last 10 years, and so you know it feels so disheartening. And you want to talk, you know, to Jerome's point, like what that does to even us as advocates and those of us that have seen it cycle through. Right, we've been through the good and the bad, and we know we just have to keep working. But you know, to sit with Chico Yancey, who is one of the principals at Vote, and to have him just so upset about the fact that this may be the last time that he votes. Even as he also, you know, he also made history by voting for himself on the ballot. And so there are all of these things that are so heavy for even those of us that have been doing this work, to see us fight for 10 years and make these unbelievable changes that were, you know, bipartisan changes. We're now seeing all of that being wiped away with the stroke of a pen. And I think that that's what's unfortunate. And I would be remiss if, you know, if it wasn't even more maddening to have all of these decisions being made by a legislature that's seated on illegal maps. So the judge has, you know, Judge Dick has already ruled that, you know, our state maps are illegal. Louisiana stands to gain 6 House seats and 3 Senate seats that are minority majority. And so the idea that an illegal body that is not representative of this population is, you know, not only moving these terrible policies and turning Louisiana into a police state, we just had voters getting tickets at the early voting locations. I mean, you know, like it's just so many things that we're starting to see, you know, that are just these assaults on our democracy and our ability to vote. But also, too, at the same time that we're moving towards realizing the second minority congressional House seat, we're still at a state level being harmed by, you know, leadership that has basically been seated on illegal maps.
And I appreciate you reframing that term illegal. Who is actually conducting illegal business in our faces, if you will? And so when we think about the maps being manipulated and drawn, which then creates the gateway for all of these other conservative and suppressive policies, it is in fact illegal. We're not actually asking for anything outside of the norm. We're demanding what is both legal and ethical under the rule of law. We're going to sort of shift now to the great state of Mississippi and talk a little bit about education. And as we know, education has been under attack. The ongoing push for school choice and voucher programs has been a contentious issue in states like Mississippi and across the South. In addition, the new House Speaker in Mississippi, his name is Jason White, is vowing to expand school choice programs and reform existing public school funding, which is basically let's take money out of public schools that are already hemorrhaging and starving and place it somewhere else. And then there's the Mississippi Adequate Education Program. And it's probably not adequate at all, but it's the MAEP program, which has been a topic of contention, with the state legislature only fully funding the program twice since its creation. So, Kira, I want to talk about this notion of how do you see the proposed changes in school choice programs and public school funding reforms impacting public education in Mississippi, and in particular for marginalized communities? And really, how do these initiatives affect public school funding and equity? What are the stances the state legislatures should take to ensure that public dollars are used effectively to support equitable public education for all students? So if you can sort of wrestle with that and unpack that, that would be great.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you for having me here today. You know, education, in addition to voting rights and all of the policies that we've talked about thus far, really is one of the critical cornerstones of our democracy. And in a state like Mississippi, is such a big driver opportunity, particularly for those marginalized and underserved communities that you mentioned. And so for us, education policy is, you know, one of the tops of the list. You know, I was talking earlier and I was like, well, we really are working on everything right now. But the attacks on public education in a state like Mississippi is again something that's very crucial and very critical to us. And so we know that democracy is under attack, and education is a part of that. So public education is under attack in Mississippi. I can't say that again there's anything new or any of the tactics that we haven't seen before, but we do feel like now is really a critical juncture in education policy in the state. And again, we're talking about a state that 20% of the population is experiencing poverty. We have the highest poverty rate in the nation, highest child poverty rate in the nation, and another 31% of households can't afford basic household necessities. And so having education being a driver of opportunity to provide opportunities for students to support or strengthen communities to really advance the state in itself. Again, that's kind of the backdrop of what we're seeing in terms of education right now. We started a campaign a couple years ago at One Voice called the Miseducation of Public Education. So this is when there was a lot going on around our social studies standards and revising them, and legislators' input on what should and should not be taught in public schools. This is a campaign that was related to some of the book bans that were going on. That's related to education. It's related to some of the DEI policies that we're seeing now. And so, there's this miseducation part of education as well, and the suppression of kind of the true history of, this country and Mississippi as a whole. And overall, our work right now focuses on the dismantling attacks on public schools in general. And these are attacks that are driven through privatization methods, of course, the school choice policies that you talked about, consolidation efforts in the state. And these are all things that really do impact those marginalized communities. Majority minority communities are Black communities, these communities experiencing poverty. Our ultimate goal at One Voice is to find the resources to make an equitable education opportunity for all children throughout the state, regardless of where they live, regardless of their zip code or background, and particularly for Black students in the state. One of the problems that we're facing now, or that we continue to face, is the lack of funding for the state's current education formula, the Mississippi Adequate Education Program that you talked about. And this was a formula designed to provide what's called an adequate education for students. So not even an exceptional education, but just kind of was the basic standard or level of funding that the state should give in order to ensure an adequate education for children. And again, that program has only been fully funded twice since its inception. So that's twice since 2008. Currently, for this school year, our public schools are underfunded by $175 million. And since the inception of that program, they've been underfunded by over $3.5 billion. And so that's the gap that we're talking about in terms of funding. But instead of policies directed at increasing that level of funding, we've seen all of these school choice policies come about through the wanting of legislators of voucher programs, about the growth of charter schools, and through consolidation efforts, through giving ARPA money to private schools. Is so much going on under the guise of school choice in these privatization efforts. And so one of the things that we've been concerned about, or we've been fighting against in terms of problem solving, is to not use political ideologies like choice and these kind of things to resolve the issue of public education in the state, but to ensure that every school has the resources it needs before legislatures decide to try to come up with something new that, again, is more of a political ideology and it doesn't have any background or effectiveness outside of conservative talking point that's flown across the country. And again, I say that again as a nonprofit and nonpartisan, but it's just a reality of kind of what we're dealing with right now. And so a part of, again, that work is, again, ensuring that every student has a quality public education. But again, we don't want an adequate education. We want more than that. And we know that in fighting this education policy fight, in addition to the other ones, again, that we talked about, that we can make sure that every child in Mississippi has an opportunity to thrive. And we hope, again, that it's the same for other states in the South.
Thank you. Thank you. And as we continue to think about how all of this plays in together, You go back to these supermajorities, as Leader Shelton articulated, have been illegally built off of manipulating maps and the drawing of boundary lines. And then these folks get in power and they make ridiculous decisions on the backs of our children, on the backs of our families by manipulating the education system. It is all a part of democracy being under attack. And I'm going to shift to another state, the state of Tennessee, where there is another supermajority that literally last year expelled Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. And it was a huge, as you all know, controversy around the nation. And it's a lot of animosity still steaming from that. So when you think about the Republican supermajority in Tennessee, and a reminder, we're nonpartisan, but we're not blind, there's a clear path for a specific agenda, including restrictions on LGBTQ rights, proposals to further loosen gun laws. The list goes on and on. And so, Stephen, how do you see this dynamic shaping the legislative session and its impact on minority voices within the state? And what does the issue landscape look like in Tennessee during this current session?
Whew. Thank you, Jamal. And thank you for having me and us. Thank you, everyone, for being here for today's conversation and for the question. In Tennessee, we are experiencing a legislative session that has been dehumanizing, advancing private over public interests, ignoring facts and subject matter experts, neglecting public consensus, and threatening the very health of our democracy. We have watched as the supermajority pushes their legislation through committees without discussion. And we have also watched as members of the minority are serving as the lone representatives on many committees, meaning that any unfavorable, quote unquote, unfavorable legislation from the minority wouldn't even be seconded, considered, or discussed. We have also watched committee chairs outright deny any sort of public testimony or discourse on key issues, with one senator stating that, and I quote, "Committee meetings are not public forums nor town halls." To say the least, it has been a difficult time for anyone's voices to be heard in Tennessee's legislative session, but especially the minority. Last year's expulsions of Representative Jones and Representative Pearson continue to be felt each and every day. Of note, the supermajority continues to pursue efforts such as preventing expelled members from being reappointed by local governing bodies to their vacated seats, and even preventing the voting public from re-electing expelled members to continue representing them. The intentions behind these efforts could not be any more clear. And last year, 2 young Black men beat the white supermajority at their own game. And now the white supermajority is changing the rules in their favor. This isn't new, and it certainly isn't surprising. But what it does is it shows us, the people of Tennessee and the rest of the country, that we have a lot of work ahead of us if we're going to achieve any semblance of justice for the most vulnerable members of our communities. And that includes our duly elected representatives. So when it comes to the issue landscape itself, we are seeing no good response by the supermajority and the legislature to last year's Covenant school shooting. At this point, it's been completely swept under the rug. We are seeing dangerous legislation focused on our LGBTQ and immigrant communities, including banning pride flags in schools and requiring that driver's license exams only be administered in English without any possibility of language translation or interpretation assistance. We're seeing efforts to force our children to watch anti-abortion videos in their classrooms while also criminalizing children under the age of 13 who are pregnant and seek out-of-state abortions. Mind you, Tennessee has made absolutely zero exceptions to its abortion ban, zero. Tennessee is also likely most well known right now for the statewide pro-voucher movement making its way through the legislature. We have an unqualified appointed commissioner of education who is advocating for this alongside our governor. Bipartisan school boards across the state are unanimously opposed to this effort, and their voices are being ignored outright. The consequences, if vouchers were to pass, will be devastating for every student in Tennessee, especially in our rural, poorest, and ironically, our most conservative communities. And of course, on the democracy side, we are experiencing copycat efforts from Florida that would make it harder for organizations to conduct voter registration, prohibit certain people for the first time from helping others to register to vote, and even increase the penalties for protesting in the streets. So all of this is to say that while the Tennessee issue landscape is looking quite grim from the outside, know that we and so many others are unwavering in our fight on the ground for a better Tennessee for everyone. And I know that there's some Tennessee folks listening in today, so shout out to y'all.
Thank you for lifting that up, and I like how you are lifting up the fact that we are still in the fight. That although the balls are being thrown at our community and we're taking hit after hit, we're still fighting forward, and we're slowly but surely changing the realities, even though the rules are rigged against us. I want to remind folks to please drop your questions and comments in whatever platform you're using or viewing for this discussion, so that as we get ready to unpack and discuss, your Q&A, we have them. So Ryan, you're hearing and seeing, just like many of us, that there is a range of legislation trending from voter suppression to, criminal justice, anti-LGBTQ, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion. Talk to us about what's happening. Is it merely a coincidence? And the fact that it's happening in the South with these illegal supermajorities, what does that really mean for the fight for civil rights and social justice?
I firmly believe the South was chosen for a reason. It's no coincidence that many of these bills are being beta tested for a larger audience. Like, for example, a lot of the abortion bans, the trigger laws that were in place, are leading up to the other side's desire for attacks on women's access to birth control, IVF, also a larger conversation on the other side around a national ban. So it's not a coincidence. And it's the Heritage Foundation, it's ALEC, it is the Federalist Society, it is Harlan Crow, David Uline. I could go on and on and on about these wealthy 1%er billionaires that, because of Citizens United, are now allowed to play in various states with their money. And that is having detrimental impacts on our communities as a whole, but even more impact on Black and Brown communities across the South. Even the Midwest, Missouri has one of the most stringent book bans in the country. And I just moved from Florida. I spent 16 years on the front lines of what I'm seeing as an authoritarian turn for the state. And so what's happening in Florida is making its way into other states. So I would argue that it's the white supremacy and the structural racism, stupid. These folks are getting smarter. This is not your garden variety racism. They're writing policy in DC and in these state legislative bodies. The courts have been places where historically we have fought they've been that third line of defense, that check and that balance. Now they're becoming hostile environments, and in many cases, the first line of defense for many of us fighting these redistricting fights. And this lie that is race neutrality, or what I like to call colorblind racism, is taking hold in our schools and resulting in these DEI bans, resulting in these bans on Black history in particular, as if we didn't build this country for free with no thank you notes, right? For fear that white kids' feelings might be hurt. Or is it that you don't want your children to find out what their ancestors did to others? But I will say young people aren't taking this lying down. And I want to just remind folks watching, many of our groups are not taking this lying down, and we won't go back. And then, just radically reimagining what our democracy looks like. It's not enough to just protect, but we have to also think about things like proportional representation. Because if you think about the runoff system in Georgia, which was put in place to keep Black people out, right? So we're having to also have these conversations around what democracy is for us as communities, how we show up, how it shows up, how we hold folks accountable. And lastly, what I will say that I'm really extremely excited about is some of the states taking the initiative to protect voting rights from an internal standpoint. Your state voting rights acts are really starting to really move across the country. Like I said, it's not enough to try and fight for it national. We're having to have these fights and protect the legislative victories of the last 60 and 70 years at the state level, and even the municipal level. A lot of these attacks are filtering out into our school boards, and also hostile takeovers of the ways in which our largest cities, many of which are predominantly Black and brown, administer their elections, a la Houston, right? The governor had it out for the city of Houston. God forbid elections work. And then that didn't work for him. And now he's attacking the largest school system in the state, if I'm not mistaken, by putting what was referred to as discipline centers in place of the libraries in those schools. So it's not just state level, it's filtering down into our cities, in cities that the other side believes to be too progressive.
No, thank you for lifting up that framework. Jerome, I'm curious, when we think about Alabama, as we listen and hear from Stephen and Ryan talking about these types of laws that are being beta tested, is Alabama seeing the same types of laws, quote unquote, being beta tested? And if so, when it comes to voting rights and protecting our freedoms, what strategies, both legal and grassroots, have you found to be the most effective at mobilizing communities to counter these laws that are literally being beta tested in the South and getting ready for prime time for the nation?
I know typically when people hear Alabama, they immediately think football and being first in that. Unfortunately, the legislature has kind of taken on that mindset of trying to surpass Florida in being the first to put forth these types of legislation around anti-DEI, which was in previous legislative sessions, anti-CRT, legislation around criminalizing peaceful gatherings and protests, but they labeled them as anti-riot bills. And so we have seen kind of the full gamut of oppressive and suppressive legislation here in Alabama. And so one of the things that we have had to do, and to kind of steal a twist on a phrase that Ryan just mentioned, is we've had to engage in a radical reimagination of what advocacy looks like in order to get to where we know democracy should be. And so, like previously, I'd spoken about the psychological and emotional and physical burnout that often we as advocates experience, and the general public experiences in the wave of these successive and oftentimes simultaneous pieces of legislation. And that's real, and we need to acknowledge that. But it's also important that we engage in a strategic deployment of the coalitions that exist already in each of our states, and specifically not just engaging them, but making sure that we all realize that we're all in this fight together. If you work in the criminal justice reform space and someone else is over there working in the expanding democracy space and someone else is in the reproductive justice space, all of these are connected. And it's important that we tie the thread through to all of those, not just for our own space, but making sure that the general public is aware that all of these are tied together. And so that's one of the things that, particularly over the past year, that our various coalitions here in Alabama have really tried to dive deep and kind of tie that thread through for them. To kind of harken back to something in the news that everyone has seen, obviously, within the past couple of weeks, the Alabama Supreme Court made the ruling about IVF. And to kind of clarify for people, the Supreme Court did not ban IVF. They just ruled that based on a state law that the legislature had passed 2 or 3 years prior, that embryos, even frozen embryos, were in fact human life. They were children, unborn children. And as a result of that, if somebody in an IVF clinic accidentally drops that frozen embryo, you have now killed a child. That ruling came from a policy, a piece of legislation that was enacted. That legislation was enacted because of particular individuals that were voted into office. Those same individuals that restricted bodily autonomy in that case are the same ones that are passing legislation geared around the overcriminalization of Black and brown bodies. Legislation that also ends up preventing individuals from having the eligibility to register to vote. And so when we are able to connect each of those things that are kind of facially completely disparate issues, but tie them all together, we are able to build a bigger, stronger, more diverse coalition. So that way we're not the ones having to go it alone, that there are people to the left of me, people to the right of me, and I don't have to face those arrows, those balls alone, that I've got a team with me. And we have seen, as I said, incredible success in that. Just this past week, I believe, when the anti-DEI bill came through, even though the legislation ultimately passed, we were able to bring down to the State House over 100 college students to march through the halls of the Capitol and for the first time really engage in the legislative process. And so it's also important that we think about these things long term, because we didn't get to where we are through short-term efforts by those in opposition to us. This was a long charted out course. And so it's also important that we make sure that we not just kind of in a perfunctory, performative way, give young folks a seat at the table, that we make sure that they are actively engaged and involved and have a voice and a say in how we move forward as well.
And I appreciate the framework of the team analogy. And Ashley, we know that the Power Coalition is all about team in terms of building people power. And given that these challenges, these sort of beta testing of policies that are horrendous, are happening all across the southern states during this legislative session, what role do you see in terms of regional collaboration playing in countering these attacks on democracy? And how can the Power Coalition and other values-aligned organizations really help to forge both strategic and effective regional partnerships in order to push back against these measures?
Absolutely. I mean, so many feelings about so much of what has already been said and what feels so familiar about all of our states. One of the things that's interesting about the proliferation of all of these, the rhetoric and the policies from states like Florida and Texas is that the one thing that I won't speak for Alabama or Tennessee, but I don't think I'd be wrong in saying that our states are poor. Louisiana is the second poorest. Mississippi is the poorest. And so when you start playing these games, it all sounds good until you realize that you have your poor state and your budget. This criminal justice session that they just had, it's going to cost us over $30 million to put in place all of these, like this more, kind of punitive criminal justice system in the state of Louisiana, and then juxtapose that to you're willing to spend almost $30 million on that, but you won't receive, the $17 million for the summer EBT feeding program, right? And then our governor goes on to ask the federal government to save the crawfish farmers because crawfish is too high. And so it's like it's about that, I think we're seeing a lot too around the narrative of deservingness. Like who gets to be taken care of, who gets subsidies from the government versus, and then how we also talk about it. And so, but back to your question, I have so many thoughts. Louisiana's facing a constitutional convention. One of the things I'll say about this new legislative body and the session, we are more connected than we've ever been because we don't have a choice, right? Like we've always been a pretty, tight-knit group. We all, work together. We saw unbelievable collaboration between all of the groups during the criminal justice session. And we are seeing that same thing, right into as we go into the regular session. And so we're fighting, we're supporting each other. We're working with legislators, who care and who are trying to fight for a better Louisiana. And, and I think that for the organizations, one of the things that we've been trying to do is provide regrants, provide, support for infographics and fact sheets. And as somebody mentioned, not the fact sheets matter, but, at the end of the day, our state should be dealing in what's real. And then, I think that, one of the things that we also, remind folks is that when we go around the state of Louisiana, and I'm sure this is true in a lot of the South, I'm more alike than I am different than the people that I talk to, right? And all of the things that's happening at our state capitol are not the feelings of most of the people in my state. And so I always get so frustrated because it's like, gosh, how do we get here? And so working with our partners, working at the intersections of all of these issues, has been one of our, strengths and has been our power. We're going to continue to do that. Continue to move and support base building groups, continue to allow to support those base building groups to influence policy in the state and to fight. Because when we think about this constitutional convention, I mean, think about how scary that is. They're going to open the state's constitution, and they get to choose the delegates. So we're not even sure who's even going to be in the room as they are determining what the future constitution of the state of Louisiana looks like. And then, the one thing that gives us a little, puts a little salve on the open wound is that the Louisiana voters then get to vote on whatever foolishness comes out of this constitutional convention. But here's what we know, right? They're talking about the school funding formula. Louisiana has always fully funded that. And so now we want to adopt a system similar to Mississippi, where, you're constantly fighting to make sure that our children are getting a good quality public education. They're stripping the power of other entities that are outside of the legislature. Again, I don't even want to give them any ideas and speak more about what's possible in this convention, but it's not lost on anyone that, again, in the second poorest state and the most incarcerated state in the country, that these kinds of policies and these ideologies, are going to bump up against where, they're going to bump up against the realities of where we live, our budget, the lack of resources because we won't raise taxes. They're talking about doing away with the state income tax. I mean, all of these things that are, that are unfortunate, and, maybe it works for Texas because Texas is huge, but it's definitely not going to work for Louisiana or any of the deeper southern states. And so again, we pride ourselves on our partnerships and our coalitions and working together with partners as much as we can, supporting them any way that we can. And then also too, using the legal strategy. I think it is unfortunate that, we have to always go to the federal courts. But as I sit here before you today, I'm reminded that I'm a Black woman, that every right and freedom that I have was given to me by the federal courts. And so here we are 60 years later, the 60th, anniversary of Freedom Summer. All of these, anniversaries of all of these iconic civil rights moments, and we're fighting for the same thing we were fighting for 60 years ago. And I think that, I think it was Ryan who mentioned it earlier, at the same time that they're trying to gaslight us into this post-racial narrative that somehow, because Barack Obama was president, that we're post-racial. And, we had a legislator tell us about the second, about why they had to actually redistrict the state fairly. He said, well, we don't even have, Jim Crow anymore. And it's not like we have hoses and dogs in the streets. And I was like, so that's the baseline. That's where we are, is that, that you think that what it means for me to be a citizen in this state is that I should be grateful that they're not dogs, policemen and, sicking dogs on me and hosing me with, are you serious? No, and also for the record, all of the things that they're doing with policy right now is reinstating Jim Crow and many of the policies of the Old South. And again, I think, I was struck by another panel that I was on, and one of the panelists talked about if they get everything they want on the other side of this regular session, that Louisiana will very much so look like and feel like a post-Reconstruction. Think about that. It is a gut punch around the fact that in 2024, Louisiana is facing a future that looks very much so like our past, and not even our most recent past.
And I think as we connect these dots around a regional strategy, one of the things that jumps out is that the data tells the story as well. For the NAACP, we have partnered with an organization called ESRI to do place-based mapping so that our community members are empowered with the realities of what's happening to them and around them so that they can go and fight for legislation in the proactive way that actually connects the dots. So I love this notion of making sure that we're looking at all of the nuances, following the money, but we have the power to map and track what is happening so that we're proactively able to fight and mount a regional strategy that makes sense. But this is all driven by, in many ways, activists. And so, Stephen, when we think about Democratic lawmakers and activists in Tennessee and across the South, you see folks turning to more aggressive tactics to draw attention to the positions that we're fighting for and the issues that we're fighting for across these states. And as a result, we're also seeing more legislation attacking the citizens' right to free speech and the right to protest. So talk to us about how you view the role of activism in influencing policy in your state, especially when faced with a legislature that is perceived to be punitive towards any dissent.
I know I mentioned it earlier, but the clearest example to me is that there's an effort right now to further criminalize protesting in the streets and turn that into a felony in Tennessee, which is deeply concerning. I will say the halls of the Tennessee State Capitol are no longer silent. They are loud and getting louder by the day. But like Ashley, I don't want to give anyone any ideas, but it really is an incredible sight to witness and be part of. And even with all of the recent efforts to stifle public discourse and deny voters the ability to choose their representatives, the role of activism in influencing policy in Tennessee is more important than ever. Although the cards are stacked against us, we're taking every opportunity to speak and advocate with anyone and everyone who will give us the time of day. Oftentimes it falls into silence, but there are moments when it makes a real difference. And I'll give you an example of something from just the past week. Back to the statewide pro-voucher movement that we're experiencing right now, we have seen numerous members of the supermajority outright defying their constituents and their local education leaders. Not only is the general public advocating in opposition to vouchers, we have principals, superintendents, and again, unanimous and bipartisan school boards in every county of the state advocating in opposition. And yet we're here right now considering this as a possibility for Tennessee. Just last week, however, a Republican representative from the wealthiest and one of the most conservative counties in the state publicly addressed the issue when it came up for discussion in their committee and openly sided with their constituents in opposition to the voucher movement and criticized the efforts of their own party in its entirety. The public rebuke sent waves and chatter through the media, the legislature, our organizations, and our communities. And while the outcome of this movement is still yet to be seen, we know confidently that such open criticism from someone would not have made its way without the tireless activism of so many people. We're talking about the representatives' constituents. We're talking about all of the incredible organizations at Civic Tennessee that I get to work with every single day. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize Mattia Powell, who's our executive director, an incredible Black woman who's the leader that our organization needs, that Tennessee needs. And I am deeply grateful for their leadership and working under them. And so with all of that said, that was a positive moment in such a grim time that we're experiencing. And so having those positive moments resulting from activism, direct advocacy, and action is encouraging. And it reminds us of how important it is to always center our people and our communities and to make sure we're challenging our elected officials to humanize their decision-making and to not make decisions blindly.
No, thank you for that. And I'm glad, Stephen, you lifted up folks like Mattia. And we think about this notion of race and class playing a role in the suppression of all people and working people, especially in the South, almost race is used to keep folks suppressed and divided. And so when I think about Mississippi, Kira, and One Voice, we know that you all have placed a significant emphasis on empowering Black leadership in the state. 37% roughly of the state of Mississippi is Black folks. I think it's the largest Black population density in the nation. And so it's this notion of how do you connect those dots to the critical pathways for policy change in Mississippi? So I wonder if you could share with us and discuss how focusing in on the empowerment of Black leadership and local community support has influenced policy change in Mississippi, and what successes have you seen in terms of countering sort of the racialized mess that others have put us in, if you will?
Yeah. As you know, One Voice's work grew out of the work of the Mississippi State Conference NAACP. So it's really in our DNA to center Black people in the policy work that we do. But really one of our goals is just to empower people to be engaged in the formation of public policy that impacts their lives. So you talked about population density of Black people in the state. We know even in the capital city where all of these policy decisions are being made, it's one of the Blackest cities in the country, Jackson, Mississippi. And so just Ashley was mentioning the backdrop of these policy makers against the people that they're making policy for. I mean, some of the contrasts, couldn't be more different where our capital is in general. And so One Voice has used the empowerment of leaders the empowerment of leaders, but particularly Black leaders, as one of the driving forces for policy change in the state. We have one of the largest numbers of Black elected officials in the state, particularly on the local level. Last time we checked, we had about 148 county supervisors, 90 mayors, 21 sheriffs, 19 chancery clerks, and 21 circuit clerks. So the power that we have in terms of Black leadership in the state is something that we think could be a real driver or continue to be a real driver for policy change. And it's really about building this pipeline of leaders. And we know what the state leadership looks like at the top, but just working our way and building the infrastructure to make those who are elected or empowered, giving them the resources and the tools and the support that they need to really state their power and use their power for change in their communities. And so that's just one of the ways that we go about doing that. The other way that you mentioned was just through local community support. We know how hard it is to get good bills passed through our state legislature, the supermajority that we have. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is how do we influence some of these policies on a local level? If our state won't pass a minimum wage law to help people, what cities can do it? What cities were engaged in some of the discussions around equal pay before Mississippi became the last state to have an equal pay law? In terms of some of the federal money that's coming into the state, if there's such an issue around tax revenue and funding across the state, and we have this influx of dollars from the federal government, what power do our local elected officials have to make changes in their community? Money that didn't flow directly to the state, and how can it best be used? Even in some of the decisions around voting rights and using those clerks to advance some voting rights, we're doing that and looking at voter purge laws throughout the state, going through local communities or local circuit clerks to kind of identify some of these issues, whereas we would have a big roadblock in the state in terms of criminal justice reform, redistricting, doing that work on a local level, and really knowing that, really change does start. There's such a organizing tradition in Mississippi, and really leaning on that local community organizing to help influence change in the state. But our goal this year has really been about building resilient communities and using a whole community approach, meaning it takes all of us to help influence policy change, especially when we're faced with the opposition that we have. But we're hopeful whenever we keep people at the center of the work. We're also encouraging our lawmakers and our policymakers to keep people at the center of the policy decisions that they make. And eventually we'll get to that point to where that's more of a reality.
No, thank you for lifting that up. And I want to take a point of personal privilege and say that for all of us, we understand that it is about making sure that we're centering frontline communities to have a political voice, period. That when you walk around, drive around, or bike around your neighborhood, do the people that live near you actually have a voice? Are they represented in the electoral decisions that are being made and the policy decisions that are being made? That is democracy. That is actually what we are fighting for. It is not quote unquote radical. It's what it should be. And so we appreciate this dialogue. We're now going to pivot to some questions from the audience, folks that are watching patiently. I have a few that I'm just going to throw out to our panelists. The first one is, how important is social media and the accurate dissemination of these aggressive legislative assaults to democracy and free speech? Like, what does it mean to make sure that we're bridging sort of the gap between folks who are seasoned, experts, know the work, with a younger populace and folks who literally are just trying to make life happen? How do we connect those dots in really using social media and accurate dissemination of information? That question is thrown out to anyone who wants to tackle it.
Check your resources. Because we are also in the age of AI, right? And Facebook and Instagram and have many positive aspects for our movement work, right? Getting the word out, and there are groups on the ground that post to their individual accounts about legislative session. Just be sure you are verifying your resources, right? I typically look at the Brennan Center as one, Voting Rights Lab. Just those are just some resources to help with some of the information that's being thrown at people. Because unfortunately, social media is also like a internet version of telephone, right? The story starts getting bigger and changes as the messenger, like stuff like that can happen. So just make sure you are checking your resources, where this stuff is coming from. Ask some of the groups that are doing the work, that go to legislative session, do their lobby days. I don't really feel like there are any stupid questions to ask. So I would even offer myself up for certain things. This is what I do. I track legislation among many things and look at political landscapes. So that's be one of my best practices.
Ashley, you may be on mute.
Look, I'm just muted. Sorry. I totally agree, Ryan. And I think one other thing I think I'd be remiss if I didn't call out, because I think it is part of my current frustration, is that like we also have to address mainstream media. I feel like there are a lot of social media influencers and a lot of folks, especially in the African American community, who are leaders, people and influencers and people that, our young folks are looking up to. And I feel like they are selling something that doesn't feel authentic to democracy and to what is best for Black folks. And so again, I don't, I wouldn't let a celebrity decide what house I live in, what car I'm buying, what food I'm buying at the store. And so don't let them decide who's going to run this country for you. Like, don't let them, make this work that's ahead of us in this presidential election, in these congressional seats. Don't make this about, their personality. This is actually about your life. I always say over and over again, voting is a social determinant of health. These people are deciding whether you are safe in your job, whether your children are safe at school, whether you can make money, whether you can't. Yeah, I mean, like, this is about, there's a thing that's happening too around, there's a reason that, we're seeing the attack on labor laws and all of these different things. It's because they want to ensure a low wage workforce. I mean, there's just so many pieces to this narrative, but I just also, ask folks to check your influencers, right? Check who you're listening to and make sure that your opinion is based on where you live and what's going to make your life and your family's life better.
There's so much richness in, oh, sorry, Kara.
No, I was just going to add, because I think there's no greater debate in the policy advocacy world right now other than narrative, how to get messaging out to people in general, not just on social media. Again, we're not picking sides, but there's one side that's really, really good at messaging. In our last governor's race in Mississippi, there are commercials that ran right before the election that just said this particular candidate is, akin to Joe Biden and don't vote for him. And that's all that he had to say. Meanwhile, we're on the ground trying to explain what income tax elimination is, trying to explain what our funding formula is, trying to explain why Medicaid expansion works or how does it work. And so there is really a huge gap right now in terms of narrative framing and messaging in the policy advocacy community around so many of these issues. And so it's not just on social media, but there's a larger discussion that has to be made by that. And I want to also say a lot of discussions around bringing younger people in. So I hear all the time, what do younger people need to vote? And I'm slowly inching out of that conversation to where I can jump in as a younger person and speak for these groups. But I when we look at some of the history of civil rights movements in the country, a lot of that work was started, or was a lot of the momentum was had by quote unquote younger people at that time. And so I would say that younger people have always been a part of policy change and influence in the country. I think we're seeing a widening of the gap in terms of age disparities, in terms of our policy advocacy work. And it's something that I would say almost every policy advocacy organization has to do more work on. But, and I say that to say, if social media is used as a tool, that it really can be useful. And when we've seen the impact of that in Mississippi, and I think around the country, where social media has been used for good to influence good policy, and that there's definitely avenues around it. It's just that conversation of how do we kind of let some stuff go and let younger people do what they do, how they do it, and finding ways to connect them to that. But I think a part of it is reaching them where they are as well, the same that we do from any community. And so I don't want it always to be a conversation that's kind of negative around those types of things, because that's honestly the world that we're in right now and the reality that a lot of us have to face.
No, that all makes sense. The next question we want to lift up is this notion of revealing who the boogeyman is. And you all, for those of you who watch old school cartoons like Scooby-Doo, when they take the mask off, this question is really asking the question, are the bills being orchestrated? The ones that Ryan has said are being beta tested. I'm still in that, Ryan. Who are they? Who's behind it? Is it ALEC? Is it the Heritage Foundation? Let's name names. Who's behind the orchestration of these bad policies that are happening all across the South?
They're working in tandem, to be honest with you. Federalist Society, courts, right? They are padding our courts at every level. Mm-hmm. With billionaire funding, right? That's why I argue they're working together. They're communicating in some way. And ALEC is developing language for these bills, deciding which states that they're going to try these things out in. So I wouldn't say one is like, let me handle North Carolina while you handle Tennessee. They're working in coordination with each other, and that's the point. Many of these bad bills are vague and cruel on purpose. Which is why you see so much confusion around rights restoration in Florida, around who's cleared to vote and who's not. And quite frankly, the powers that be aren't really trying to figure that step out to make it easier for folks to find out if they are truly have their rights restored or not. So I would say they're working together. Just in like Federal Society is the courts, right? So, but trust and believe they're communicating with each other. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the Koch brothers as well. So there's a lot of money behind this. I encourage folks to read about Citizens United, because that's where quite a bit of this began. There's probably always been money in politics, but just obscene amounts with no prohibition, no limits on what people can contribute to and causes. So,
thank you for that. And this is about sharing the real news and speaking truth to power. We're going to do one more question from the audience. And the question is, are there discussions or strategies around confronting uncontested statewide races? Because in states like Alabama and other states, it is literally how these illegal supermajorities have structured districts. They got one person that's going to win. And so it literally becomes this thing where the uncontested realities have to be addressed. And so, Jerome, I'm going to look to you to help us answer this question.
Yeah, so to answer the question in short, yes. The longer discussion is it's often challenging to find candidates who are both qualified and willing to go through the gauntlet that they know is going to await them in a state where pretty much regularly you can almost kind of bank on a 63 to 37% turnout without counting the kind of special election races with Senator Doug Jones being elected in 2017. But even in that race, I mean, it took an alleged pedophile, essentially, of former Chief Justice Roy Moore to be the other person on the ballot for a Democratic candidate or a progressive candidate to ultimately win. And so those are kind of the realities that a lot of campaigns or potential candidates kind of take into consideration as they're doing their calculus on doing that. And so, yeah, I think to kind of bring it back into some of the previous discussions that we've had, it's incredibly important that we build up a bench for individuals to kind of work their way up to those statewide races. And so that's why doing the work around battling illegal and unconstitutional state and municipal district maps is so important, because that's where folks kind of get their feet under them, starting off at the city council level and then working up to a state representative level where they have the opportunity to get some work done, get some name recognition, so that way they have hopefully long-term the opportunity to mount a potentially successful statewide race. And so that's kind of the challenge that we're looking at, because as of right now, the only people oftentimes that jump into those statewide races, whether it's the Public Service Commission dealing with utilities or treasurer or what have you, agricultural commissioner, they're individuals who nobody has ever heard of and often haven't held positions previously. And so it's really difficult to mount the kind of campaign that you need to when you're literally starting from scratch just a couple of months out from the general.
Mm-hmm. And I think I would just add one quick thing to that too about, like the bench also feels light, right? I mean, I think if you look across the, at every level, right? Like we've got to do more work and provide more investment in leadership across our work, right? I think that Louisiana has, for as long as I can remember, 50% of every House and Senate seat goes unchallenged, right? And we have to begin to do the work to be able to build a bench that's ready to take on these folks that go unchallenged, and then to think about how hard we're working right now in legislative session, and to know that it could have been a few votes here and a few votes there that could have gotten us a better candidate, a better elected that was going to do the work of the people versus someone that was there to continue to sell us out to industry, oil and gas. It's always a deep, dark reminder when you're standing in that building that, this is the work that's ahead of us. And so definitely building a bench and then threading the needle around making sure that we're getting as many Black and brown folks registered to vote as possible. Because again, when, they play the games that they ultimately play, we need to make sure that we have as many, Black and brown voters as possible to be able to engage in the process. And so again, building that bench, not only for folks to run for office, but also donors, and helping people understand that, yes, it's your $100 It's not, you don't have to wait on the money from, DC or wherever. I always reflect on Devontae Lewis, who is our public service commissioner, and he's one of the youngest elected. He's actually the highest elected Black official in the state of Louisiana. And we had to fight so hard for him to be able to raise funds and for donors to see him. And so that's also a piece of this too, is like, how are we thinking about different ways to raise the kind of money that's actually necessary for Black and brown folks to seek office? Because that is also a part of this, is that we've made this a money game. And we want people to be able to run and be authentic and not have to sell out to different interests so that they can get the money they need to actually run a real race.
This is all adding up, and as we come to a close this evening, want to end on a note that really focuses in on the fight forward. NAACP is 115 years old. I don't think we have any members that are still alive from day one, but decades of folks in the fight. And so want to hear from each one of you in terms of what does it mean in terms of countering, what's happening in the South and in your states. What message would you like to convey to those who feel disillusioned or hopeless or disempowered by the political climate and the current realities in the states?
Well, I'll start. I will say what I said in the chat. I think that we are seeing the fight, the last fight and struggle of the Southern strategy. It is fighting for its life. Our country has probably been majority minority for a minute. The census has admitted to undercounting us for years, and probably longer. And so as we see this fight for power, we as a people, we have to be okay with the fact that we deserve power, we have power, and then we have to stand in it and fight. And so as we see all of these things happening, I'm not discouraged. I am actually here for the fight, because my children will inherit something that is better than what I inherited. And also my kids will have more, when I close my eyes, it is my hope that my work will result in my children having more rights than I currently have today. And so it's going to require us to fight. I think it's always been true of the civil rights movement to today that, right before you win, right before there's that breakthrough, it's always hardest. And we have to be consistent and we have to keep showing up because this isn't just about us. This is about our children and our grandchildren. This is about the future of this democracy. And if we let them destroy this democracy, then we will never get it back. We will never get it back. And we are seeing them chip away at it very meticulously. And so I just encourage everybody to get involved. Don't listen to the rhetoric. All is not lost. We are here and a growing, rising majority. Stand in your power.
And panelists, this is actually your closing statement. You got about 60 seconds. So we're going to ask it. Everybody leans in answering this question.
I'll go. I echo all of what Ashley is saying. I think we have no choice, really. I think when people hear about politics, they think red or blue, liberal, conservative. But, we've been telling people, if you care about the roads that you drive on, the schools that your children go to, what hospital you can or cannot get to. I mean, we're literally talking about life and death situations in Mississippi, and I know across the South as well. So, we have no choice, but that's to say that in a good way. We don't give up. The fight continues, and I think it's as long as we keep people at the center of it, I think that's what drives a lot of us who are in this particular fight, keeping people at the center, our children at the center, and just making sure that there's something good to leave behind. And in the words of one of our program managers, Mr. Frank Figures, who always leaves every conversation saying, stay strong. I think that's what I would leave people with, just stay strong and continue the fight, and we'll make it.
I will say that you're not alone in feeling the way that you're feeling. Find someone or a group of people in your community who resonates with your vision for what you want to see. Get together with them and get to work. Don't let progress too small seem small. It is grand. In in that fight, don't let that utopian vision at the end of it all deter you from joining the fight. Last year in Nashville, Tennessee, only one person who was incarcerated voted from jail in all of 2023. And I want to shout out Free Hearts and the Free the Vote Coalition in Tennessee that fought for months to advocate to change that systemically. And just the other week in March, 12 people voted from jail in Nashville. And that's a win. And that is the result of real change. And we're excited for what's to come. So let that small progress, that small change seem big, because it really is.
I'll end with what Cliff and Latasha always end our conversations with, around how we lead with Black love and Black joy. Black Voters Matter 365, can't stop, won't stop. I want everybody on here watching. You are the change you want to see. What are the issues that you care about? And get involved. I'm happy to say there's so many more options out now than what I had beyond working for an elected official, thank God. But don't be discouraged. Democracy needs protecting and strengthening 365 all year round, okay? Because it only takes one election to go backwards. And we won't go back.
So SPLC's headquarters are in Montgomery, Alabama, right near the steps of the state capitol and around the corner from Dexter Avenue Memorial Baptist Church. And all of us know we are just a couple of weeks, a little over a week removed from the commemoration of the Selma Jubilee and the march from Selma to Montgomery. And so every day as I walk from our office to the state capitol, I am reminded of the fact that I am literally walking in the footsteps of those soldiers in the 1960s. And so the words that I would leave with people as we are facing all of this onslaught of oppression and suppression is that we may be beaten, but we're unbroken. We may be bent, but we are unbowed. And at the end of the day, we too shall overcome.
Please give a virtual round of applause to our speakers representing Black Voters Matter Fund, Civic Tennessee, the Power Coalition of Louisiana, Southern Poverty Law Center, and One Voice in Mississippi. This has been an enlightening and powerful discussion as we think about the work connected to democracy under attack. Now, I want to remind folks that this initiative has been made possible through a collaboration between Alabama Values, Solve, and Groundworks Project. And I want to do a special thanks to the team at Alabama Values, Anisha and her team, for producing this evening's briefing live and ensuring that the visuals and content was both informing and engaging. Now, remember, folks, to stay connected, stay informed, and engaged in the fight. You can start by tapping in with the organizations highlighted here this evening, including my own, the NAACP. You should also follow all of us on social media, including Alabama Values at ALA Values. I want to get that right, ALA Values. And consider becoming a member of the Solve Network at Solve Network Official and Groundworks Project at Groundwork Proj, Proj. And these things are being shared on the screen. And then the last shameless plug, this weekend we got the Image Awards. You can watch it live on BET, CBS, Country Music Channel, and other simulcasts. But at the end of the day, I think the big takeaway is that our communities on the front lines are still fighting forward. And no matter what the other side does, and no matter how they try to stack the cards against us, as Jerome said, no matter how many balls they're throwing our way, we're going to keep fighting forward and catching as many balls, deflecting, and making sure that our communities are put at the center of democracy. Thank you all, and have a good evening.